Imagine if you could simply pick up the phone and call your departed loved ones at will. Hi, everyone. I'm Alexis Brooks. In this little segment of Conscious Commentary, we're going to explore this idea of dialing up the dead as a very real and promising possibility.
Right now on Higher Journeys with Alexis Brooks.
We've long been fascinated by this idea that it's possible to communicate with the dead. Now, there's many people who claim that they have done just that and under many different circumstances and conditions, whether involuntarily, say when someone is overcome with grief from the loss, they might hear the loved one say something like, "It's okay, I'm fine." Or maybe it's a visual sign like a bird or butterfly hovering around the person who's grieving. There are so many reports of these things happening. And I do feel that there's certainly something significant to these otherwise profound coincidences. But what if you could use certain conditions on our planet and initiate communication with loved ones in spirit? I did an interview with researcher and experiencer Susan Manowich a couple of months ago, where she talked about how heightened solar activity could be a catalyst to bring the visible and invisible worlds together. Let's listen to this clip.
When the solar activity seems to hit, like when we get what's called a geomagnetic storm, when that actually impacts the earth and impacts this thing called the KP index, you see that more of a manifestation in the physical at that point. My father, who had passed away 7 years ago, was I was really close to my dad. Like, we had a great funny relationship, and he always made a joke. He said, "I'm going to come back and haunt all of you, afterwards." He was just funny. So it was interesting because I literally woke up in the morning and I'm so sensitive to the solar activity. So I could feel like the geomagnetic storm it was hitting. And I hear him, and like, as I'm waking up, I hear him say, "How come nobody calls me?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean? Don't you guys realize that when these types of things happen, meaning the solar activity, that the things are more clear for me to communicate and for you to communicate. So why don't you just pick up the phone and call? You could reach out and contact." And so, I mean, obviously we need more evidence at that point, but I think what we're learning is that these solar activities are legit energy that is impacting us, but like you said, conversely, we can put things out as well.
Hmm. Now, Susan, who's an avid researcher into solar energies and the influence they have on our planet, and particularly on us, admits she's very sensitive to these fluctuations, and she can usually tell when there's been a kick up in solar activity. But even she was astonished when she heard her deceased father tell her that these energies can actually be harnessed to create a bridge between the living and the dead. I'll never forget when we got to this part of our talk, I was completely intrigued by this idea. And so I wanted to look into it further, hence the reason for doing this week's commentary on the idea of solar activity and contact with the dead. I'm going to say that again: solar activity and contact with the dead. Is there something to this? Now, I put the dead in air quotes. I'm going to do that right now in air quotes because the debate continues among many in the spiritual community as to whether death, as we understand it, is even possible, meaning that consciousness and energy cannot be annihilated. Therefore, we're not dead, but rather transition to another form of existence. Okay. But let's get back to this idea of solar fluctuations and particularly strong solar or geomagnetic activity and what effect it might have on this phenomenon of bridging the living with the dead. Now, let's go back to what Susan told us, her father told her about connection using strong solar activity. He said, and I'm quoting, "Don't you realize," he said something like, "Don't you realize that when these types of things happen, the solar activity," he meant, "things are more clear for me to communicate and for you to communicate. So why don't you just pick up the phone and call? You can reach out and contact." This may sound a little out there for some folks watching, and I know for a lot of you, maybe not. But this to me was an emphatic statement on the part of her deceased father. Now, she admittedly said after she shared that with us that the evidence is yet to be clear on this, and I agree. But, as far as I'm concerned, I do think it's worth exploring. And along the way, maybe we will collect enough evidence along the way to show that there is something to this. So I want to dig into this a bit deeper. Let's do that. First, I want to reference Susan's father saying, you can just pick up the phone and call. Pick up the phone. Now, he didn't say, hey, you can just talk to me and I'll answer you. He specifically said, pick up the phone. So let's examine this. I think there's something to be said about that. So let's talk about this device. I got one right here we call a smartphone that might work, as a catalyst to bridge communication with the spirit world, but particularly when solar activity is strong. Now, there's a few things I want to go into here. First, have you ever heard the term or the acronym ADC? It stands for after death communication. Now, this is a term that was coined by Afterlife researchers Bill and Judy Guggenheim. Actually, I believe Bill Guggenheim recently passed, but they wrote the book Hello from Heaven back in the mid 90s. And I actually reviewed this book for them in the, I think, early 2000s. And I've since recommended it and actually given copies away to friends who might benefit from these stories. It's a great book, tons of amazing stories. But actually, Hello from Heaven, a little background, documents over 3,300 accounts of ADCs over the course of 7 years. It's a long stretch of research. Now, what they did was they categorized these specific areas where ADCs can occur, like sensing a presence, feeling a touch, hearing a voice, etc. But one area they covered, which they admitted was far less common, but did happen, were what they called telephone ADCs. I'm going to read a passage from the section of their book that describes telephone ADCs. Listen to this. Imagine you hear a telephone ringing when you answer it. You hear the voice of a deceased loved one and receive a brief message, or you may have a two-way conversation. We call these experiences telephone ADCs or ADC phone calls, which may take place while you are sound asleep or wide awake. They are the least common of the 12 major type of after-death communication. Receiving a telephone call and having a conversation with a deceased relative or friend while you are sleeping is like any other sleep state ADC. The only difference is you are speaking to each other on a phone rather than meeting face to face. An awake telephone ADC has some interesting characteristics. Your phone actually rings. When you pick it up and say hello, you hear a deceased loved one on the line. His or her voice may sound strong and clear, or it may seem to be coming from far away after the call is complete. You won't hear the receiver at the other end being hung up. For that matter, there won't be any kind of disconnect sound or even a dial tone. Instead, the phone will be silent as though the line had been cut. Wow, this is a fascinating one for me, this whole idea of telephone ADCs. I was so taken by this phenomenon that I actually reported on an account in which someone personally told me about a similar situation where she and her sister were on the phone shortly after their father had died. And she said that all of a sudden she heard a sort of static sound. Her sister went away, and then the voice of her father came through calling her name and saying really, really clear, I'm here, I'm here. Crazy. I know. I actually wrote about this in my 2014 book, Conscious Musings. Now, I can go a heck of a lot farther with these sorts of accounts, and they definitely deserve more investigation just from the sheer evidence and the process that may be taking place in order to make this happen. But where I want to go here with this is what role the telephone, an electronic device, moreover these days a digital device, may be playing and acting as a conduit for ADCs. Now, this coupled with strong solar activity just might create the perfect condition for communication with the deceased to take place. I mean, when you think about our devices, particularly today, and what they're riding on insofar as a digital platform, as well as wireless towers all over the place, you can only imagine what may be possible when you combine the right frequencies emanating from the device, as well as the frequencies coming from heightened solar activity. Digital tech, including smartphones, have been shown to be directly affected by high solar activity. This is a fact, such as solar flares and CMEs, which are coronal mass ejections. Now, what happens is these CMEs, as an example, release huge amounts of electromagnetic radiation and charged particles. They shoot into space, right? And when these interact with the Earth's magnetosphere and the ionosphere, they can cause what is known as space weather. Sometimes they're referred to as solar storms, depending on the strength of the activity. But I think they can potentially trigger other activity in connection with non-physical realms. In this case, right, we're talking about the spirit realm or deceased individuals. How many times have you heard stories of ghostly activity triggering malfunctions with lights and TVs and, yes, even telephones? So, where I'm far from being scientifically trained, I've always felt that there is a direct connection or ability for the non physical realm to either influence or utilize certain electromagnetic conditions to interact with the physical realm. I mean, when I say tons of stories are out there, right, about this sort of thing, ghostly presence burning lights out or turning radios on and off. I bet if you've had such an encounter, I'd be curious to know whether this has happened, something that you've witnessed. But it's been covered in paranormal research ad nauseum. So we're not going to go in too far into this, but it happens all the time, right? So, look, getting back to what Susan's father said, where I agree with her and that we definitely need more evidence as to the validity of this, I don't think this idea is too far fetched in possibility. I also think there was a point where her father was trying to convey, he was trying to convey a point with the fact that we can utilize these strong solar influences to, who knows, bridge ourselves with multiple realities or worlds, maybe even multiple dimensions. I recall a project that researcher Lynne McTaggart conducted called the Intention Experiment. Have you ever heard of that? Where she researched how certain geomagnetic fluctuations in Earth's atmosphere can have a major impact on the capacity of an individual to both send and receive information out of the five sense framework, so ESP. Now, the experiment demonstrated the possibility that during periods of fairly moderate to high solar activity, get this, the act of sending conscious intention, say the intention of connecting with a departed loved one in this case, can be more potent. But interestingly, she also noted that when things are quiet and solar activity is fairly low, an individual can be fairly more attuned to receiving information. So we're talking about sending and receiving. And apparently, according to her research, the data showed that when things are what she called more noisy, we're more primed to send versus quiet to receive. Very interesting. So let's go back to the case of Susan and her father. Let's say, in this case, Susan reaching out to her father during higher than normal solar activity, plus perhaps using the phone to do so, might just make the connection happen. Who knows? But on the flip side, we have to keep this in mind. Even when things are quiet, as far as the sun is concerned, we're still primed to receive information from that side of the veil. So in any case, the connection can always be made. When I think about what Susan's father told her about the fact that a connection across the veil is, I think he used the word clearer during high solar activity, as I started to think about it, guys, more and more, coupled with the data that Lynne McTaggart gathered during her intention experiment. You need to go get that book. Maybe I'll put a link. It's fabulous. But the information that she gathered and this idea that sending information or intending to make a connection is higher during what she described as noisy geomagnetic activity. My God, this is a stunning correlation. Well, was to me. This to me corroborates what Susan's father had to say. Yes, from the so-called afterlife. This is huge, guys. Let me know what you think. Now, also consider this. If this unique condition can actually act as a conduit bridging the physical with the non physical, what might make this so? How is it that we as human beings are able to do such a thing? So I gave this a little bit of a think myself. And my surmise is that we as electrical beings also play a role in this process. It could be, and I stress it could be, that the frequency that's emitted during high solar activity also acts as a sort of agitator, we could call it, allowing us as electrical beings to resonate with a higher frequency, making that bridge a possibility. I mean, after all, it's said that those who are in a discarnate or non corporeal, to be fancy, state do tend to exist at a higher, I'm just going to say a different frequency than we do. It's less dense. Look, I'm certainly not a scientist. I said that before. I'm just doing a little crude calculation here. And a lot of this makes sense when you do a little bit of dot connecting. So I have a question for you. Would it be worth the time for you to maybe play around with this idea of working actively to connect to a loved one or anyone that you know for that matter, hopefully not an enemy, but a friend or a family member, someone that you know that you miss, when the solar activity is high? Would you try this experiment? Is there someone you want to connect with? I'm sure there is, to see whether a bridge can be created. I say it's worth a try. How else are we going to know what our capacity is unless we try in all of these things? So I have a suggestion for you. First, let me recommend a site that I've used in the past that's fairly easy to navigate, and that's called Space Weather Live. I think I'm going to put up a screenshot here. I'll definitely put a link in the description. They're actually a nonprofit, I think, out of Belgium, who utilizes data from several sources to curate all the latest information on solar storms. So they're getting it maybe from NOAA. That's another site that I would recommend. I've used that. It's great for also aurora watchers if you're into that. And they also have a great Facebook page that summarizes the day's activities or forecasts for solar activity. It can be a little daunting to navigate some of these things because there's certainly charts that I can't discern. But if you can just get kind of the lowdown, or are we in an M class flare, or low? I think Susan called it the KP index. I'm actually, admittedly, not that familiar with the process, but you can at least get a sense of, are we in some sort of heightened solar activity? And like I said, there are other resources like NOAA. I think NOAA, by the way, is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Also has a pretty good site called Space Weather Prediction Center. So you can actually search out some for yourself. I think there are a few out there. But either way, find yourself a good monitoring resource. And when solar activity gets intense, try to connect. Try to connect via phone. Why not? Or without it. But I think there was a point to Susan's father saying, pick up the phone and call, even though he had a little bit of a sense of humor, as Susan told us. I think he knew something. Now, look, of course, there's no guarantee there'll be success. And I do feel there are so many other factors that are going on here when connection is made, not the least of which is what I'm going to call the energy mindset or consciousness of the loved one you're trying to reach. I mean, you remember what Susan's father said even before he died. He said jokingly, I'm going to come back and haunt you. I've heard other people say that. No, please don't do that. But even though he was playing around with him, he obviously had the mindset, I think, that he could do such a thing. In other words, I think there was a predisposition on his part that these connections could indeed be made. So why not give it a try? Either way, of course, I want to hear your thoughts on the whole matter. So please comment. Please comment. Let me know where you are with this idea, what you thought about this sort of mini hypothesis of mine, or maybe such a thing has already occurred with you and you'd like to share your story. But here's the thought, and then we'll close. Have you ever had a very intense encounter with a spirit presence? Maybe a departed loved one that you heard or even saw at the foot of your bed? I've heard countless stories of that. And for you, let's say the experience was so unforgettable, you even remember the date it happened. Well, here's a challenge I have for you. If possible, maybe you could go back and look at that particular date to see if there was any abnormal solar or geomagnetic activity. I mean, I know they've been calculating or tracking data on solar activity for quite a few years. I don't know how many years, but for quite a few years. Now, look, let's say you did. Let's say that you do have a memory of contacting a loved one or a loved one showing up at the foot of your bed. I've heard that countless times. And you are able to determine the actual date. And you did find out that on that date there was there was a geomagnetic storm going on. It's certainly not going to prove that that was happening just because that was going on. But wouldn't it be interesting to do a little investigation to see what was happening on that day? Hey, you never know. Again, I want to hear from you on this so y'all know what to do, right? All right, journeyers, look, it's always good to spend time with you and talk about the most intriguing topics on the planet and off, obviously. Hey, listen, before we sign off, be sure to join me next week. I got another great guest coming up where I will be interviewing someone else that's super tuned into these realms of the beyond. Her name is Rachel. She's a psychic medium, being clairvoyant. She's got all the clairs: clairvoyance, clairaudience, clairsentience. She has all the clairs. And she has a great perspective on how the spirit world works and interact with us. We're going to listen to this. We're going to be having a discussion about karma, how to identify it, and mostly how to work through it, or some people say burn it off. I don't think it's an easy thing to understand, but I do think that with everything, there are multiple dimensions to this thing, this idea we call karma. But we're not going to stop there. We're also going to be discussing how all of this relates to the connection with ancestral wounds and healing. I think there are a lot of people really kind of digging deep and wanting to unpack their own story when it comes to the ancestral lineage and why they may be living the life that they are. So I want to go into this with her in that regard. We're also going to get a little controversial. We're going to talk about what are considered generational curses. It's a strong word, but I think it's something that's been used certainly in our vernacular and something also worth talking about. We're going to get into what has been deemed the Kennedy curse, or what is known as the Camelot curse. So it's going to be a good conversation. You definitely don't want to miss that episode next week. So y'all know what to do if you haven't already. That is, please go ahead, hit the subscribe button. And if the, if the notification bell still works, go ahead. You might as well hit that one too. Either way, look, the journey continues right here on Higher Journeys. Thanks for joining me, everyone. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.